Oh, Verena. Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome on this Saturday with this new webinar with Angus from Potentialife that I think all of you know very well now. So very excited for this session today about the science of habits. So throughout the whole webinar, at any point in time, if you have questions, feel very free to shoot them across directly in the chat, and I'll make sure to ask those to Angus along the way. And so just, you can interact as much as you think is good. So without further ado, Angus, over to you. Very excited to hear about the science of habits.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So hi, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be back. It feels as though I've only been away for a few days, but it's still nice to be back. So today's session will take maybe about an hour together. Feel free just to fire away any questions, either about this session or just more generally about your Potentialife modules. This is a time for interaction and for answering questions as well. But in today's session, I thought I'd raise a question about making change stick. Making change stick. Now, most of you are in your third, fourth, or fifth Potentialife module at this stage. So you've had a look at strengths, you've had a look at health and energy. Some of you might already be looking at absorption. And at this point, people are starting to typically say, there's some things I could see I could change to my life here. So nice ideas, but how can I really be sure that these sort of ideas, if I decide to make a change, that they're actually going to stick? So I thought today would be a good time to raise this question and confront it head on. And what I'm going to do is challenge the very idea of making changes stick and offer a different way of talking about it and therefore thinking about it, and provide some tips. In fact, I'm going to provide 7 tips that hopefully, if you take away, you'll find them useful for each of your personal development journeys. So I'm going to share my screen and let's fire away. So screen share, here we go. This one, yeah. So you should be seeing a slide now that says making changes stick with Potentialife. If you're not, wave at me, otherwise I assume it's all good. So yeah, the first thing, let's just challenge the language here. So I don't like either the word change or the word stick. So I guess we're off to a pretty bad start on a session that's all about making the changes stick. Now, why is this language not the most helpful language? Well, first of all, there's something about the word change that I don't like, because it kind of implies that somehow we're being taken away from who we are. You're going to change me. That means I'm no longer going to be me. So I don't kind of necessarily like that word. And the word stick, I don't particularly like, because it feels as though you're taking some glue and sticking to me to a place where I don't really want to be. That's what glue is supposed to do. It's fighting against an object that would rather not be there. And so there's something sort of painful and feels like hard work if we talk about making change stick. So maybe there's a different way of talking about this that'll actually help us. And behind words are actual thoughts. So this is more than just a question of semantics. And so the alternative way is, instead of talking about changing and sticking, rather talking about being consistent. And so the idea of being the better version of yourself, even if that involves change, by the way, to me feels much more of a palatable and easy to accept way of talking about this. And the idea of being consistent is also a very important word, because as I think I said in a previous session, I'm going to say again today, the real question that we should all be asking ourselves is, how can we more consistently be that better version of ourselves? Oftentimes, it's not that we don't know what good looks like. We actually know what good looks like in many cases. It's just that we tend not to do it consistently. And so I just want to remind you again, oops, just undone my power cable, which if I run out of power is going to be a problem. Here we go, power's back. So let me remind you of this very important quote. Now, John Dryden was a British poet, indeed what's called a poet laureate, which is the poet of the King and the Queen. He was the first ever poet laureate from 1531. And he said at the time something that was poetic and philosophical, which is, we first make our habits and then our habits make us. Now, that remained sort of profound philosophy until about 20 years ago. And about 20 years ago, it didn't cease to be profound philosophy, but it also became something else. And what it became 20 years ago was actually scientifically valid, in the sense that the scientists that understand how our brains work realize that this idea that we are fundamentally creatures of habit is actually a scientific truth. And so let's enjoy the wisdom of our forefathers who were able to craft such beautiful phrases like this, and let's keep them and use them for ourselves. But let's know at the same time that there's some real truth there. And so, what is the underlying science? Well, I think I may have referred to this before, but I think it's just so important that we just need to dwell on it again. Let's just remember that our brains are made up of neural pathways. And until 1998, which is only about 20 years ago, we didn't know this. But now we do know, because the instruments that look inside our brains are able to see that we have these pathways inside our brain through which electrical currents pass. And our habits are defined by the size of these neural pathways. So in other words, the more you repeat an activity so that it becomes a habit and second nature, the more deeper and entrenched are your neural pathways. It was really, really fundamental when the scientists understood this, because this led to a fundamental change and a shift in our understanding of human possibility and human development. Until then, it was largely believed that our brains were fixed and that we had personalities from childhood. Now, of course, we still have personalities, but the big change is, in answer to the question, is it possible to change? The answer is yes, it is possible to change. But through a process of repetition, of small changes that leads to new habit formation. This is very profound and very fundamental. And anytime you hear somebody say something like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, it's time to challenge that, because it's just not true. And if you're a young dog, then of course it's not true. Now, some of you may play musical instruments. I do, but very badly. I play the guitar. I've been playing very badly the guitar since I was about 14 years old. And any of you that play music will perhaps get a feel for what we're talking about here. I remember when I was 14 and struggling with the guitar and just thinking, this is just so impossible. The two-hand coordination, I'm just never, ever going to be able to do this. And I'd look at other people playing the guitar well and say, that's just impossible. I just don't get it. And then time goes by, you practice, you give up, you pick it up again, you give up. And then there's some future date where not only can I play the guitar, but it's easy, completely easy. And not only is it easy, I can't imagine how it ever was that I wasn't able to play the guitar. It's just become second nature. That is my neural pathways changing shape. And any of us who've learned a musical instrument or learned a language through a process of repetition will understand this. we can all change like this. If you're looking for a visual metaphor here, when we go back to these neural pathways, think of water running down a mountainside. And imagine that after a while, the water forms into streams and gullies, and those gullies become deeper and more entrenched. Well, if you wanted to deviate one of those gullies into a different path, you can do. At the beginning, it'll be a little bit haphazard and the water is going to splash all over the place. But after a while, there'll be a new gully, and that will become a new stream and a new pathway, and you will have created a new stream of water. And this is exactly how we need to be thinking about creating new habits as well. So this metaphor here is really something to keep in mind. And as you think about change, there's lots of very practical implications of this fundamental idea that I'm sharing with you. And what I'd like to do now is share with you 7 practical implications or takeaways from this. And they're on this page here. One by one, let's walk through these. The first one has to do with failure. And what I want to share with you is an idea that failure isn't the end of the process. Failure is part of the process. Now, that might sound like one of those cliches where somebody says, you know, the sign of a person is not whether they fall over or not, it's how they pick themselves up. I'm not talking about cliches here. I'm actually talking about how we learn as human beings. Remember yourself. Remember your kid brothers or sisters, or maybe if you're lucky enough to have your own children, look at your own kids and look at how they learn to eat. I remember my kids. I've got photos of my kids, my son putting an ice cream cone right in the middle of his forehead when he was a kid, as he was learning how to find his mouth. This is how kids learn to eat. Trial and error. And the important word in trial and error is error. You keep getting it wrong until finally you get it right. Now, this isn't just how, by the way, how we as human beings learn and develop. It's also in the world of AI and robots, how robots through machine learning also develop and learn. And let me share a story with you. That very same son of mine who, when he was 3 years old, was putting an ice cream in the middle of his forehead. When he was 21 years old, he did an internship at DeepMind at Google, which is one of their research laboratories where they're playing with robots and AI. And he was just telling me the story of how they teach a robot to take an electrical plug and to plug that plug into the wall socket. And the way they do it is by getting the robot to, with its arm, to take that plug and just to keep trying plugging in until finally the robot figures out how to do it. It's trial and error. And they then had 2 robots, each with their arm, one with the plug and one with the socket. And they were trying to get it right, coordinating. And the way to essentially program the robot is to help the 2 of them do it, let them trial and error until they finally get it right. So this notion of trial and error is fundamental. And so every time something goes wrong and you maybe become disheartened and you think, well, maybe this is the end of the road, it's really important that you say, you know what, getting it wrong is part of the process. It's the only way to learn. And it should be a philosophy for life, despite all the difficulties that we encounter. And this is why we have these wonderful famous quotes, for example, from Thomas Edison, who said, I failed my way to success. On his road to all of the inventions that he made in the field of electricity, every time it went wrong, he didn't feel as though he'd failed and it was all over. It was just he hadn't got it right yet. And that's how we need to be thinking about this. So this is my first message for you, to rethink how you think about failure. It's part of the process, not the end of the process. The second thing, willpower. Willpower. How should we be thinking about willpower? Well, a lot of us think that wouldn't our lives be a lot easier if we had more willpower? then we could do more, then we could achieve more determination, more willpower. Well, think about those New Year's resolutions for a second. Some of you may be in countries and cultures where you're typically at the start of each new year, you set yourself some resolutions. Things that you're going to do next year that you didn't do last year. Well, I have some bad news for you. They don't work. Did you know that 50% of New Year's resolutions have been abandoned by the second Friday in January? That's not a long time after the 1st of January, and 88% by the second week of February. So the vast majority of resolutions barely last a month. Why? What's going on? Well, resolutions essentially implicitly draw on the idea of willpower. Somehow next year, I'm going to have more willpower than I had last year. And so somehow I'm going to be able to do next year what I didn't do last year. Well, the sad news is that we don't have more willpower. There's no more willpower to be had, and we need to think differently about change. And let me just share with you a little piece of research here that involves chocolate chip cookies. So this is a little story. I need to sort of bring a story to life for you, but I think you might find it quite interesting. So this is a piece of scientific research where they had two groups of people involving cookies and a maths test. And so what they were doing was having the subjects of the test of this experiment do a very difficult maths test. And in the first group, whilst they were waiting to go into the room to do the maths test, they sat a plate of chocolate chip cookies next to them. They come straight out of the oven. They smell delicious. And they said, you know, please don't actually eat those cookies. Just leave them there. It's actually for a different experiment. You're going to go and do your maths test in 10 minutes. So you're kind of sitting there 10 minutes, not eating those cookies, and then you go in and to do the maths test. That's the first group. Now, the second group, it was the same setup, but instead of chocolate chip cookies, they placed some rather sour smelling, unpleasant beetroots next to you. So you're sitting there, they come in, they place these beetroots next to you. For 10 minutes, you're waiting. Nobody really wants to eat beetroots. Nobody likes beetroots, really. And then you go in and do your maths test. Now, what they were testing for here, actually, was not your mathematical ability, because this maths test was actually almost impossible to complete. What they were testing for was how long do you persevere with the maths test before giving up? And in these two groups, there was a huge difference. One group gave up almost immediately, and another group persevered quite a long time. Now, I wonder, if I were to ask you, which group do you think gave up more quickly? The cookie group or the beetroot group? Feel free just to throw in some comments into the chat box. I'd be interested if anybody has an immediate point of view on this. I'd love to hear what people have to say. Here we go. Beetroots, this is giving up more quickly, yeah? Cookies, cookies, cookies. Okay, quite a few cookies. And a yes, cookies. Yeah. So we have a mixed group. Oh, it's the return of the beetroots. Sounds like a title of a horror movie. Oh, somebody who's, yeah. Okay, well, let me, I think many of you are kind of getting this right. So the bottom line is going on here is that what the scientists were trying to understand is, when it comes to willpower, is willpower a muscle or a reservoir? A muscle is something that you can develop by exercising. It becomes stronger and bigger. So in other words, if we use our willpower, do we actually become stronger like a muscle? Or is it a reservoir? When you use it, you actually empty it out. Get it? Well, guess what? It's a reservoir. So you use it up. So that cookie group, they were sitting in that room, not eating those cookies, going, I really want to eat one of those cookies right now. And then they get into the room next door and say, oh, I can't bother with that maths test. I'm exhausted. I've used up all my willpower trying to not eat those cookies. So this is the point, folks. Willpower, we don't have a lot of it, and there's no more to be had because it's a reservoir, not a muscle. So the message is, when it comes to thinking about how to change, please do not somehow call upon your willpower or say, I'd like to have more willpower. I must use my willpower. It's the wrong way of thinking about it. It's not going to help. Of course, that raises another question. What is going to help? But at least let's put to bed this idea of willpower. It's not where we should be looking for answers. Now, the answers obviously has something to do with what we've just been talking about around new habit formation. And so there's another thought to think about, which think less in terms of willpower and think more in terms of, wait for it, way power. So willpower gives away to way power. Think about the method of change and repetition that's going to take you there. And the first tip of way power I want to share with you is the idea of small changes. Celebrate small changes. Again, this isn't just some kind of cliche, let's all be nice to each other and celebrate when we do the small stuff. No, that's not what I mean here. What I'm saying is the only way to big change is through small changes. We don't make big unitary changes. We get to big change through small changes. Some of you may be familiar with this idea of compound interest in your bank account. That's the good metaphor here. 3% of compound interest is a small amount. But if you leave it in your bank account over a while, it becomes a huge amount of money because it compounds up. That's how we need to be thinking about change. And who better to talk about this than Albert Einstein? Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. He who doesn't pays it. Just thought I'd throw that in because I think it's kind of cool that Einstein was talking about compound interest. But we really do need to embrace this idea of starting small. It's the only way to build up. So if you're planning on losing 10 kilograms in weight, you're going to start by eating an apple. Everybody starts by eating an apple. That's where everything begins, or the equivalent to your apple. Of course, you'll end up doing a lot more than that, but it starts with something. That's really, really important. The next one I want to talk about. So we've talked about failing is part of the process. This isn't just some kind of cliche. It's really important. Forget about willpower because it's a reservoir, not a muscle. Celebrate the small changes. Next one. This one's really important.
Angus, could you ask me a question?
Yeah.
Like, a question asking, so Vizal was asking, if willpower is a reservoir, it means you should be able to develop it too. So like, what kind of tactics could you use to fill it? And I mean, I suppose that means, when does this reservoir reset itself as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a great question. And, it's actually linked a lot to some of the things you'll be exploring in the program around the idea of recovery and everything that we're doing to view our lives as though we have a daily body battery or even a weekly body battery, which includes lots of things actually, including our willpower and everything that we're doing in terms of managing our energy, in terms of sleep, nutrition, exercise, sneaky emotional depleters that impact how we connect with each other. That has huge amounts of impact on our willpower, our desire, our perseverance. Other things that are really important when it comes to willpower, as you'll see in modules 9 and 10, are your sense of purpose. Knowing why you're doing what you're doing makes it much easier to persevere and much easier not to take no for an answer. And that's fundamental when it comes to recharging that reservoir. So great question. And thanks for interrupting me in my sort of my stream of consciousness on this. So the next one, number 4, define what you're going to do, not what you're not going to do. Now, what on earth am I talking about here? Well, the idea is it's impossible physically to get rid of old habits by trying to work on those old habits directly. Now, let's start with the physics of this, and then we'll come to some examples. These neural pathways, once they're entrenched, they're always going to be there. So that deep gully of going down the mountainside, it's always going to be there once it's formed. The question is, are you going to let the water flow down that gully, or will you have deviated the water down a different path? And I was in a taxi in London about a month ago, and I got chatting with the taxi driver. As some of you may know, London taxi drivers are very chatty people. And he says, I'm an alcoholic. I was thinking, hang on a second, he's my taxi driver. He's telling me he's an alcoholic. That doesn't sound good. I better get out. He says, no, don't worry. I haven't had a drop of alcohol for 14 years, but I'm an alcoholic. What he was saying was that neural pathway, that gully in the mountainside is still there. But he makes the choice every day not to let the water go down that gully because he's found something else to do. He's found something better for his life. That is a fundamental realization. You have to find alternative pathways to create that make the old pathways feel redundant, rather than becoming fixated on trying to eliminate the negative pathway you're trying to get rid of. And I'll actually give you an example from my own life in a minute that also has to do with alcohol, although I don't think I'm at the alcoholic level of alcohol consumption. So that's a very important thing. You can't eliminate old habits by trying to eliminate them directly. You have to create alternative, positive new habits that render the old habits redundant. Now, the next one, sometimes if you say this message, people say, okay, I get it. I kind of get the mountain, the stream of water. I kind of hear what you're saying, but how on earth do you do that? And I think one very important tip here is to look for ways of making it easier for yourself. And I'm going to give you an example from my life here from the last few months that has to do with lockdown. And it has to do with how much red wine I was drinking. And this is real. This is a real story. This is Angus talking to you. So I was in lockdown and I really have always really liked red wine. I have been buying up a collection of red wine for many, many years. And I found myself in lockdown with not a lot to do. And so I started drinking more red wine than I would normally drink. So maybe instead of maybe a couple of times a week, I was drinking some red wine every single night. Every single evening, sit down at dinner in the evening, have maybe 2 or 3 glasses of red wine. Now, I don't think that absolute amount of alcohol is kind of setting me off the charts, but nevertheless, it was definitely a new place for me to be in. And I was actually quite enjoying it, to be honest with you. This is quite enjoyable. I was getting to drink all this wine that I'd been accumulating over many years. But then I went to the doctor and I had a regular checkup, and I was just talking to him about this. He says, well, if you're worried about it, I think you should stop for 1 month. And then it's just good discipline. Just stop for a month. And I thought, hang on a second, I don't want to stop drinking wine. I really like my wine. How am I going to do this? And And I found a way to make it easier for myself by finding an alternative pleasure. And what happened was that I bought, pretty much at the same time, a sports watch. I'm wearing it now. It's one of these Garmin sports watches. You may be familiar with them. There's Apple, you know, everybody, lots of people make sports watches. And I noticed something. This sports watch sees everything. If you have one glass of wine, the next morning, it will be visible on your stress indicator. 2 glasses of wine, it's even more visible. 3, even more. 0 glasses of wine, it comes out completely different. This is because when you're going to bed at night, your body is still processing the alcohol and you don't have as good a night's sleep. And it's completely transparent and invisible the next morning. I thought that was really interesting. I couldn't believe it because I couldn't really feel it in my body. And yet this device was able to feel it on my behalf. And so I found a new game to play, which is managing this little stressometer and making sure that when I woke up in the morning, it would be at 0 every day, which of course meant that I wouldn't be drinking any wine. At that point, this was easy. I'd forgotten about the red wine. I was enjoying this new game more. Now, this is perhaps a small, not particularly important piece of life change. It's not as though I'm an alcoholic or I've been smoking a packet of cigarettes a day since the age of 14 and all of a sudden have to stop smoking. I'm aware of that. But as an illustration of the idea of finding an alternative game to play in order to make it easy for yourself, I think it fits perfectly the idea. And so if you're thinking about the need to stop doing something that you don't want to do anymore, look for an alternative game that you like the look of that means that you don't do this. You don't need to do this anymore. Now, message number 6, procrastination. What do we do about procrastination? I wonder how many people on this call are subject to procrastination. If you're wondering what maybe it's not a word that is clear to everybody, this is when you tend to postpone until tomorrow what you should be doing today. And of course, you then postpone until the next day, and you end up never quite getting around to doing those things that you could have perhaps just done in 5 minutes. Well, there's an interesting message here. And I can tell you, I suffer from procrastination. I have to fight every day against my own procrastination. Just not quite getting around to stuff that is actually pretty easy to do, but for whatever reason, I just don't quite get around to doing it. Now, there is luckily a very practical tool, which I actually try to use. But let me explain. If you are somebody who tends to procrastinate, you have a certain view of the world. And that view is, I need to have motivation in order to be able to do the thing I'm supposed to do. In other words, it's only once the motivation kicks in that I finally feel that I'll get around to doing it. Sounds perfectly reasonable. However, those people who tend not to procrastinate, they actually think differently. They've understood something different and much more profound, which is the motivation kicks in once you start the activity. Think of exam revision. I remember when I was at university and it was exam season. So we're in the country I was living in, this was typically around March time, March, April. And I knew I needed to start revision, but I just couldn't get around to it. I just couldn't bring myself to start revision, and the days would become weeks, and then the weeks would probably become months, and I still haven't really got started. And then one day you have no choice, you just have to start. So I'm getting stuck into my different subjects, biology, chemistry, and physics. And you know what? It's actually quite interesting. I actually quite like biology. It's actually pretty interesting stuff. And chemistry is quite good too, actually. And so the motivation kicked in. All I needed to do was to start in the first place. How stupid I was to be implicitly waiting for the motivation to kick in. So what can we do about this? If this is true, what can we do? Well, there's a very practical technique. And this is not just Angus talking. This is a sort of scientifically valid technique. It's called the 5-minute liftoff. What's this? This is this idea that you don't have to commit to doing the full activity. Just tell yourself you're going to do 5 minutes. Give yourself the option to stop after 5 minutes. That's not too hard. Surely 5 minutes is doable. Of course it is. But the secret is, most of the time, 5 minutes is enough for the motivation to kick in. And then you're ready to carry on. And so the 5-minute liftoff is a really valuable technique for all of us who are subject to procrastination. And you know what? I think many of us probably are. So it's definitely worth putting onto your list of tips. So now, tip number 7. Be a social animal. We are social animals. We do stuff together. And that's why you're all in teams. Because when we work in teams, we achieve much more. And doing Potentialife in teams, because you're having those conversations, means that you're bouncing ideas off each other, you learn more, and you're going to try out more things. Now, some of you may be familiar with a company called Weight Watchers. This is a dieting company. It's a company that helps people to lose weight. Now, they have a huge database of individuals who over many years have been trying to lose weight, some successfully, others less successfully. And they actually published a study in 2011, which was peer-reviewed, published in Lancet. And in this study, they were comparing groups of people who are losing weight together with individuals who are just doing it on their own. And there were 2 very important findings. Number 1, in groups, people were losing much more weight than people who are on their own. 5.5 kilograms on average versus 2.2. That's a big difference. It's more than twice. And secondly, not only do people lose more weight, but once the diet has come to an end, those people who were in groups were 60% more likely to keep that weight off afterwards. So not only do you take more off, you keep it off. This is because we're social animals. We support each other. The interaction is something to look forward to. We apply peer pressure to each other. We're accountable for each other, and we bounce ideas off each other. This is fundamental. So whatever endeavor you're in, don't try and do it all on your own. Recognize that we are social animals. So I just wanted to leave those 7 ideas with you as you think about that rather strange subject of making changes stick. Remember, it's less about making changes stick, but more about being consistently that better version of yourself. And these 7 ideas, if you just hold on to them, stick them in your back pocket, and just perhaps remember each of the little stories or metaphors that I shared with you, it'll go a long way to helping you on your journey of change. So that was what I wanted to sort of share with you from a talking to you point of view. Now I'm very happy to field any questions. So maybe Greg, if you're able just to help me process some of those, perhaps you could just field. And by the way, other people can, feel free to raise your hand or just to type any questions in, and I'll do my best to provide some answers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angus. Really, really love that. So there's 2 questions that have come in. One from Ziggy Mantas, who's saying, how do you fight anxiousness that appears after some serious procrastination?
Yeah, I know all about that. I guess we all do, right? And you know what? Sometimes I feel like I have a little bit of that anxiousness every day of my life. Because as a procrastinator, I'm there's a danger of a little bit of procrastinating happening to me every single day. And with it comes that anxiousness and that guilt and that loss of self-esteem that maybe I'm just not that high-performing person that somehow I think I should be. We know what the answer is. The question is how to do it. The answer is to get started, to make the anxiety go away, because you're actually taking the procrastination away. And so all I can do really is just to repeat back to you is to give it a try, get going on something. Activity will make the anxiety go away. It's the immobility that creates a sort of a place where the anxiety can fester and develop.
Got another question from Path. So he's saying, what to do if motivation doesn't kick in after 5 minutes?
Yeah, well, then we'll rename this the 7-minute liftoff. So I think, you know, the 5 minutes is it's one of those catchy titles, and I think in most cases it's probably adequate. But you know what? If you use the 5 minutes lift off to get started, then at least you've achieved something. You've got started. And so all I can do is encourage you to carry on until the motivation does kick in. And maybe it'll be 7 minutes, maybe it'll 10 minutes. But at least you've broken through the first barrier, was to actually get started in the first place.
Great. So just keep trying to do it. We'll get going. We've got a question from Nishant. You might need to help me just to rephrase this. So the question is, a lot of times perfect or organized approaches are required in doing the tasks. So how can these tasks be distributed in the team without compromising on quality or OCDs?
So I'm not sure I really understand the question. So Nishant, feel free to elaborate. But I can guess one or two things going on in there. The first
hi,
one.
Yeah.
Hi,
Please go
Nishant.
on. Hi, Angus. So I was wondering, so a lot of times I distribute the task among my team members, but they end up either the text is not justified or the headings are not being bold, something like that. And I end up doing all the tasks by myself. So I was wondering if you can help me maybe overcoming the OCDs or this bacteria I have of maintaining the organized structure of the task.
So you mean, in other words, you have that feeling that if only I did everything on my own, it would be a lot easier and better. Is that the idea?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, this is the very essence of actually making teamwork work for you. Right? And what you're kind of saying is your team isn't working for you, because your feeling right now is you'd be better off doing it on your own. Is that right?
Yeah. To some degrees, yes.
Yeah. And the only thing to do is to have very explicit conversations with your team. And you should be, in a caring way, you should be authentic in terms of talking about this, saying, look, I have the impression right now that if I were to do this on my own, it would be working better. Obviously, this cannot be true, because that would imply that we don't have a team. So let's have a conversation with each team member about what the expectation is and what the expected deliverable is and the level of quality is, in order to liberate you from this feeling. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable conversation to have, in order to establish the fact that you are indeed actually a team and not just an individual with a set of people around you that are actually a burden to you. You must have those straight conversations.
Thank you so much.
We have another question that I actually relate to a lot from Bea, who's saying, I can go for months on end with new routines and habits that are really conducive to living and working better. But as soon as I experience an emotional setback, I'll find myself dismantling the hard-won habits in a huge way. And then while the cycle, sorry, another question came in. And then while the cycle happens again in the future, any advice on breaking it out of the cycle?
Yeah. That's it's great, and thank you, Bia, for sharing this with us. And yeah, as we said before, failure is part of the process here, and so what sometimes Tal refers to as permission to be human. We're allowed to screw up. We're human. It's just life. All we're doing is we're just living our lives. And when you fall off the wagon or get something wrong, you just have to get back on the wagon again and carry on. It's okay. It's not a failure. It's just part of the process. And so my advice is when you're doing things well, first of all, really, really enjoy and savor the fact that things are going for you well at that moment in time, and recognize that you might fall off the wagon at any moment. And it's actually okay. We're human. And that's kind of takes some of the burden of expectation off yourself. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be human. And, sometimes I say to people, it's time we all cut ourselves a little bit of slack here, and just get the small things right, and the rest will take care of itself. I just read the next question, which I really like, actually, so I'm just going to read it out. The one about procrastinators are more creative. Yeah, this is a really interesting subject. I've actually even recorded a video of myself somewhere that's on the internet on this very subject. It's a really interesting subject. There's been quite a lot of research that's been done on the necessity of liberating yourself from time constraints in order to be creative. It's perhaps not quite the same thing as procrastination, or if you're using the word procrastination, I think we're mixing up a couple of slightly different concepts. But it's true. In order to be truly creative, we need to feel as though we're completely free from constraints, including time constraints. And if that means just letting time pass us by, so be it. And I sometimes like to quote Steve Jobs here. Now, some of you may remember Steve Jobs founded Apple Computer, and then he was fired and went off to do some other things. And then he came back as the savior as Apple Computer several years later, and the rest is history. Now, the first thing he had to do when he came back to Apple was to clean up a very messy product portfolio. Most of the products were useless. And he basically got rid of every single product in the portfolio except for one, which is basically the Apple Macintosh, which was the killer product from the very outset. And there was a very famous interview of him just after he had done this cleaning up. And the interviewer said to him, "So now you've done the dirty work, Steve, what's coming next for Apple?" And he said, "You know what? I'm just waiting for the next big thing." Now, that turned out to be prophetic, because the next big thing was the iPod, which became the iPod Touch, which became the iPhone. And the rest absolutely is history. And that was very much the next big thing. But I think it's a beautiful quote to illustrate the power of liberating yourself to really zoom in on the big thing. So yeah, I really love the idea of the link between procrastination and creativity. But at the same time, let's not use that as, dare I say, an excuse to not get around to those things that we should be just getting on with in the first place.
I have a question that came in privately. So do you have any tips on identifying a habit to start with? Often everything seems equally important, but doing everything at once isn't very effective. I assume it's better to start by focusing on one habit. So how do you prioritize?
Yes. So this is actually a great question. So there is actually a limit to the number of new habits that we can meaningfully work on at the same time. Typically 3 or 4 is the maximum that we're able to kind of juggle with all at the same time. My answer to this question, as is often the case, is do what feels most exciting / interesting / fun to you. Do the thing that's going to give you a kick. Get into the habit of making new habits by doing the easy bits first. And then the rest will follow. So I can't answer with a specific example. Should you be doing health, or should you be doing nutrition, or should you be playing to your strengths, or practicing positivity in your interactions? Of course, these are all examples, but just pick one that you kind of like the sound of and enjoy it as you're doing it. That would be my advice.
Brilliant. Following the excitement. And we have a question from Anne. So she's saying, maybe I'm kidding myself, but I feel like my productivity is much higher when I'm under time pressure. And that urgency is actually, most of the time, my friend, despite the stress level also going up. The stress level rises, however, not healthy, obviously. Any tips in terms of finding the urgency-induced productivity earlier than 2 days prior to the deadline?
Well, I am not the right person really to be talking about this because I probably spent a reasonable part of the last 20 years of my life operating according to the model you're describing, Anne. And for me, the perfect example was when I used to be sitting on planes, flying to meetings and doing the preparation for the meeting on the plane. You know, there's another 30 minutes until the plane lands, and you just got to get that preparation done. And you know what? Miraculously, the very moment those wheels touch the tarmac, you just come to the end of that presentation, you go in, and most times things just work out fine. But there's a price. There's a price, as you've described, Anne, in terms of stress level, but there's actually a price in terms of quality. Because there have been times in my life when things went okay, but they could have been better. And there have been times when I wasn't just on a 1-hour flight, but I was on a 13-hour flight flying to Singapore. And when I landed in Singapore, the preparation was a lot better than when I was just flying to Copenhagen, for example. So I think it's a question of almost professionalism. I think there's a moment in our lives when we all just have to kind of take responsibility and how high do we want to place the bar for ourselves. But the first step towards making change is the self-awareness that you're describing in your question. And in a way, the maturity that you're describing in your question, because you're acknowledging the situation that you're in with the slight trade-off. Now, having acknowledged that, you can say, you know what, we're going to do better than this. And maybe I set myself a 2-day goal. And if you calendarize it, then you'll do it, as long as the awareness is there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Angus, for answering all the questions and for the great insights. I mean, I think it's interesting, just maybe something that I've also seen and noted was the combination of making things easy and the lift off is examples of, for example, to get yourself running is just putting your shoes ready at the bottom of your bed. And then so as soon as you get up, you just put them on and then you're already going. And so always building in those things, like same for your clothes. Maybe you waste 10 minutes or you waste a bit of willpower in the morning to choose what you're going to wear. But if you prepare it the day before, then you just get up and wear it and go. So try and also build in ways of sparing some of the willpower that you actually do have in the tank as much as possible.
Yeah. And, you know, one of coming back to the example that has to do with weight loss and healthy eating, most nutritional experts will say, if you want to eat better, don't bring the devil into the kitchen. So don't buy the chocolate. Keep it out of the kitchen. And the problem will partly take care of herself because you'll eat what's available to you. You know what? Sometimes these things are just, it's like, oh yeah, that's just so obvious, but it doesn't mean to say I'm doing it. So the big point about all this stuff is it's not about knowing. It's really not about knowing. It's about applying those simple principles that relate to life routines that actually help us take those small steps and to get in a consistent kind of way to a better place.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Angus. Are there any other questions? And we've got a couple of minutes before the hour. Don't think there's any more coming in, but anyone can feel free also just to raise their hand or ask a question directly. Great. Well, I think on behalf of everyone, Angus, I can thank you sincerely. This was another great session. Really enjoyed it. And yeah, gonna go set up some good habits right away. So thanks a lot for the time again on a Saturday, and thanks everyone for joining and participating, and also for asking your questions. And we have recorded the session, so in case you want to also go back and watch it again or look back at some of the tips that were shared, you're very welcome to do that. So thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you so much, Angus, for your time and for the insight. Really fun.
Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.